As the Professor reminded us, maybe some of you here haven't caught up with the news overnight, that the World Bank released its latest index of food affordability, and the affordability index has rocketed up 15%, which means in just 3 or 6 months, I'm not quite sure from memory, 44 million more people living presumably under that $1 a day can't afford to eat. So 44 million more people going to bed partially hungry tonight. I'd like to invite the panellists to come up now onto the stage. Renata Brooks, Sam Archer, Matthew Wright and Bryan Keating. We just heard the global perspective on this challenge from Professor Swaminathan, but here in Australia, even though we are a wealthy, well-fed, developed economy, the issue of food security is an acute one. Food exports are a major part of our economy, and the capacity to grow enough food to sustain us, our economic base, and also to provide to the rest of the world the staples they currently depend upon from Australian farmers is a policy priority for our farmers directly, our economy more broadly, and millions of hungry people around the world. We are also a country vulnerable to climate change, as we've seen in recent times. First, we had the worst drought in 100 years, followed by heartbreaking floods when it just wouldn't seem to stop raining, crop-destroying cyclones. It may be cyclical, it may be a sign of what's to come. Tonight is not the night for that particular argument. The fact is, extreme weather conditions pose a challenge for our farmers and our policymakers. We will need to become more flexible. We will need to become more resilient. We'll need to adapt, and that will require the right policies, the right practices, and perhaps most importantly in the first instance, a greater commitment to research and development, and all of that takes courage. Enter the hand of government, state and federal. Our first panellist tonight is Renata Brooks. Renata has had many years of experience at a senior level in the New South Wales Department of Primary Industry, one of the drivers and the funders of agricultural R&D in that state. She currently leads the 700-strong Science and Research Division. She's a self-proclaimed believer that the solution in feeding the world starts with investing in developing local and regional solutions to food production challenges. Let's hear what she's got to say about that. Could you please welcome Renata Brooks?
Thank you, Fran, and it's wonderful to be here in front of such a large audience. Professor Swaminathan has very eloquently described the global nature of some of the challenges and the magnitude of the problems facing developing countries. But here in Australia, we can't afford to be complacent. As Fran has just said, the fragility of our comfortable situation as a net exporter of food has been amply illustrated by recent weather events in Eastern Australia. Both the immediate disruption to food distribution and the future disruption to food production from damage to crops and loss of soil are reminders that we can't take food for granted. Further, the expectations of Australian consumers for locally produced food and the importance of food production to regional economies mean that food production is a critical domestic issue which needs to be well understood from the local and regional perspective as well as the global perspective. The inextricable linkages between food production, the sustainable use of natural resources and the role of natural ecosystems cannot be overemphasised. And the lessons we learn here in Australia will not only help increase our contribution to global food supply, but will allow us to share technology and know-how with countries facing more immediate problems of absolute food availability and degradation of the natural resource base. Australia already has internationally recognised institutional arrangements and a strong record of achievement in increasing the quality and quantity of food at home and through overseas aid programs. I hope that further debate on these issues will lead to a shared understanding of the complexity of this problem and the need for ongoing attention to 3 critical areas, which I think of as the 3 Ps of food security: productivity, policies and people. Productivity improvement, as the Professor has just said, increasing farm production from the same or fewer inputs, is the single most important strategy to meet increasing local and global demand for food in a world with less water, energy and fertiliser, limited access to land and finite marine resources. And research and development is a fundamental driver of productivity and has underpinned productivity improvements of around 2.5% over recent decades here, and we will need that to continue if future challenges are to be met. And that's why R&D directed to improving productivity and food security is one of my organisation's highest priorities. Improving productivity requires attention to both ends of the equation, increasing yield and decreasing inputs to food production. So investments in breeding disease-resistant crops or manipulating flowering time to provide greater adaptability to a variable climate, or developing integrated pest management systems which reduce reliance on pesticides or more water use efficient irrigation systems all contribute to improving productivity. And to me, productivity and sustainability are flip sides of the same coin at a farm level. Improved productivity allows greater production from available natural resources. Similarly, research into recycling of waste products, for example, biochars made from municipal wastes, which have the potential to provide a green source of energy, fertilise crops and sequester carbon in the soil, will achieve gains for both productivity and the environment. And research into alternatives to food crops for bioenergy will simultaneously develop options which reduce reliance on fossil fuels and reduce competition for valuable food-producing land. Turning to the second P, international, national, state and local policy frameworks need to support and recognise food production. In New South Wales and through networks like CRISPY, we have aligned our R&D programs to contribute to a solid information base which will support development of better policy options to address access to land, water and infrastructure for food production, and to constrain or mitigate greenhouse gas production in a way which does not have negative outcomes for food production. Thirdly, we must invest in people to make sure we have the strategic leadership required to take a long-term view in the face of the many immediate and short-term distractions, and the skills and expertise to develop the knowledge and the hands-on experience to meet the challenges of the future. We also need people from government, the private sector, research, interest groups, farming, fishing and the community to actively engage in productive conversations so we can better understand the barriers to achieving greater productivity, encourage the adoption of innovations by food producers and encourage consumer behaviour which does not lead to perverse outcomes. Finally, and I didn't compare notes with Professor Swaminathan, we need the community to value and support our farmers and fishers. They face the biggest challenges and we need to work together to pool our creative energies and produce solutions which provide wins for all of us. If we can collectively address these challenges at a local, regional and national level, we'll be well placed to help the world address the global challenge of feeding the world in 2050. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Renata. And the farmer sitting up here is feeling well supported by now, and so he should, because if the farmers and the fishermen and the foresters aren't engaged in this challenge of food security, we are lost before we even begin. Our next guest knows what it means to live every day with the pressures looming from climate change, drought and bad policy decisions. Sam Archer is a fifth-generation farmer from Gundagai in the foothills of the Snowy Mountains, where together with his wife Sabrina and his 7-year-old daughter Amelie, they run a mixed farming system based on livestock, cereal production and native pastures. Their farm is a research site for a number of leading Australian institutions, including the CSIRO's Sustainable Ecosystems Program and the ANU's Centre for Resource and Environmental Studies. So he's doing his bit. The property was also selected as a pilot site for the federal government's National Environmental Stewardship Program. I think it's obvious from that list that working the land every day has engendered in Sam Archer a passionate commitment to the environment. Could you please come with me to the farm gate and welcome Sam Archer? Thanks.
Thank you, Fran. It's certainly encouraging to see so many people turn out tonight to grapple with the issues of food security. I think it's a very complex issue and it's not one that we're going to solve overnight, but it's going to involve bringing everyone along because it affects every part of society. I'm one of 150,000 farmers in Australia who produce food and fibre. Our family farm is about 1,500 hectares or 15 square kilometres, and it's ostensibly based around livestock production, sheep, cattle and a little bit of cropping. Within that context, we face competing land use demands. How do we produce food and fibre, but also environmental goods and services? We're also having to manage risk. That's production risk, climatic risk, financial risk, and increasingly regulatory risk. And throughout all of this, it's our goal, our family's goal, to have an adaptive and resilient farming system. Our farm program involves splitting up our productive and our non-productive areas, planting perennial grasses and grazing cereals on our arable areas, so those areas that we can get over with a tractor, and then grazing those areas, so the steep hills where only livestock are suited, and in that space encouraging native perennial pastures. We're also in the process of revegetating sites around our stream sides and erosion sites, and also encouraging regeneration in those areas where there's good remnant vegetation. The issues that we all face as farmers is that with this population increase, food demand's set to double. We're also having to grapple with competing land use demands. The same land that we're looking to farm on could also be utilised for mining, urban development, forestry, carbon and environmental initiatives, and therefore that's placing increasing pressure on our ability to produce food and fibre. Overlay this with climate variability and the society's expectations about delivering environmental goods and services, and you have a melting pot with the potential to reduce sustainability, productivity and profitability. And this all drops down then to food security and food sovereignty, neither of which I believe are particularly present in the Australian mind at the moment. So what might be the strategies to grapple with this balance? I believe we need to take our productive land and use that to produce food and fibre, and we take our non-productive areas and from that produce ecosystem goods and services. It would need to be private sector funded, or the consumer would need to be prepared to pay the land manager for delivering these ecological goods and services, and it would need to cover the opportunity and capital costs of doing so. Clearly, there needs to be cost-benefit in doing this and monitoring and evaluation, because it's either going to be the consumer that's paying for it or the taxpayer through government proposals. A scheme such as this would need to be voluntary, whole-of-landscape, performance-based and paid as an annual cash flow stream. Clearly, there are policy considerations that need to be taken into consideration, and Swami's already mentioned that as one of his key platforms. There needs to be a solution design that's cost-effective, whole-of-landscape. It needs to acknowledge continuity and move beyond funding and electoral cycles. Too often we see changed positions because of political imperatives. Whatever's delivered needs to be measurable and evidence-based, and it needs to be inclusive. We need to take into account the social, economical and environmental impacts. Many of you will be aware that the Murray-Darling Basin has come in for a fair shellacking because it's only addressed at this stage the environmental concerns and not the social and economic. And it also needs to be flexible. It needs to recognise that we as farmers operate in a highly variable environment and a dynamic system. Research and development, for us, it will need to be relevant, adequately funded, appropriately targeted, capable of commercial application. It can't just be done in a petri dish or a hothouse. We need to be able to roll it out across the landscape and delivered via coordinated extension programs. For me, this creates huge opportunities for farming to be proactive, to be recognised for our stewardship, to be part of the solution to feed and clothe the world, and also deliver ecological goods and services. It'll provide an annual cash flow stream on marginal land and increase the profitability and sustainability of farmers. In conclusion, farmers are inherently innovative greenies. We're constantly trying to balance production and environmental needs. We're very mindful of the fact that sustainable landscapes lead to sustainable farms, but we need a paradigm shift, both in policy settings and funding sources. And above all, we need good science, good economics and goodwill.
Thanks very much, Sam. Tonight, as we ponder the issues of food security, it is against the implied background of climate change. We are taking on board the warnings of the climate scientists. We're not debating them here tonight. We're taking them on board and we're looking about how to adapt, mitigate against the risks, which means we're accepting the need for more research into farming and food production methods in a carbon and water-constrained world with all the sustainability challenges that raises. Our next guest is firmly focused on the climate change challenge. Matthew Wright is the Executive Director of the climate solutions think tank Beyond Zero Emissions, or BZE for short. He spearheads a collaboration between pro bono researchers who reside in industry and government and academics, and his organisation has now grown to 100 research volunteers and partnerships with many leading commercial and industrial organisations. Matthew is also the current Environment Minister's Young Environmentalist. Could you please welcome Matthew Wright?
Thank you, Fran. It's fitting that I'm here speaking at this forum immediately prior to the launch of the Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre, which is a collaboration between the University of Melbourne and the Victorian Department of Primary Industries. Our organisation, the not-for-profit Beyond Zero Emissions, is made up of pro bono researchers from industry and is fortunate to have recently concluded our first research project with the University of Melbourne's Energy Research Institute, which was looking at how Australia could completely decarbonise the nation's energy sector and go to 100% renewable energy. Our partnership on the Zero Carbon Australia initiative is made up of 6 plans showing how to decarbonise all the sectors of the Australian economy. We are now launching our latest plan, which will take the comprehensive approach to land and biodiversity management across Australia, namely the Zero Carbon Australia Land Use Plan. We are working with the depth and breadth of the agriculture and forestry expertise within the University of Melbourne Sustainable Societies Institute. To cut to the chase on the plan, we will be looking firstly at forest cover and biodiversity more broadly, enhancing these to maximise the protection of as much native flora and fauna as possible, while providing enhanced key ecosystem services such as clean water provision, controlling erosion and soil salinity. We'll be balancing this utmost need against the competing needs of maintaining long-term sustainable food production and carbon sequestration. On the carbon front, it's clear now that there is already too much carbon in the atmosphere today. There's too much carbon in the atmosphere in February 2011. So if we're in that position, then we need to decarbonise pretty quick smart. Our initial look at the potential for reforestation, buffering native forests, providing new biodiverse plantation fibre harvesting, linkages in a fragmented landscape, and the use of biochar, I'll talk about that in a sec, shows that there is no opportunity in the land, soils and forests to be offsetting industrial emissions. There is limited capacity to create the net negative emissions that we must to address the problem that I stated before, that there is already too much carbon in the atmosphere today. So in numbers terms, to get each 1 part per million of CO2 out of the atmosphere, remember we're starting at 392 parts per million today, and we need to get down to something like 320. Each of that 72 parts per million difference equates to 2 billion tonnes of carbon in the atmosphere. Natural systems do some of the work, and the leading biochar researchers in the world, Professor Johannes Lehmann of Cornell University, says that biochar capacity to draw down carbon on degraded lands could be a bit over 1 billion tonnes per annum globally. But we need to move faster than that, so work needs to be done quick smart to identify appropriate land, soil type and crop waste residuals to get this up to 2 billion tonnes or more per annum. This all needs to be done without creating local particulate pollution, other environmental impacts or compromising our ability to feed and clothe the world. We like Professor Swaminathan's idea of an evergreen revolution, and we're looking at exactly how we eliminate or significantly reduce the fertiliser metals used in farm production. Great examples are coming out around the world, including a tripling of maize yields in Malawi by using agroforestry techniques with nitrate-fixing acacia trees, and potentially taking industrial waste out of municipal sewerage systems so that we can harvest the waste and recover the nutrient, in particular phosphorus. A key component of the land use plan is to create a value index to help guide Australian policymakers who have the option to adjust current land tax or other taxation regimes and subsidy regimes that are applicable to farming so as to encourage production that benefits all of society, including our global sustenance dependence. So just like India tries to value nutrition for its populace, our index will evaluate who and how many we're feeding globally today, how many of the world's 9 billion people in 2050 we should be feeding based on our relative proportion of the world's arable land. We're creating an index to look at the inputs required for production and subsequent environmental costs and value of yields. We'll weight specific products to account for inputs such as water, units per hectare and environmental costs. The index will then weight aforementioned factors against yields, but not just in terms of economic value or volume, but yields in terms of nutrition. This will include macro and micronutrients, counting positives such as carbohydrates, potassium, complex proteins and amino acids, magnesium and all the vitamins and so on. For example, Australia is now a large wine producer, but this use of productive land is only valued in economic terms, not for how important or not it is for human nutrition. Our index will assist with allocating scarce resources like water and good soils for the maximum social, environmental and economic benefit. We've just commenced our research work on the plan. We've got almost a year to run on it as yet, and many of you would have this form, and I would encourage you to sign up and donate to the university's fund so that we can deliver Australia's first comprehensive plan on how we can play our part in feeding and clothing the world out to 2050, and hopefully encourage more plans and projects in the area so that successive governments have the opportunity to make the right decisions around our food and agriculture, around the globe's food and agriculture, biodiversity and land use security. I'll be happy to collect your forms at the end and look forward to your questions and the discussion. Thank you.
And his friends call him Matthew, never let a chance go by right. We've been hearing a lot about the place for agricultural research in addressing the world's future food needs and the importance of farmers and supporting our farmers. Our final panellist is well placed to provide a researcher's perspective. Bryan Keating has spent his 35-year professional career engaged in research on agricultural productivity and sustainability, working both in Australia and in Africa. He is the inaugural director of the CSIRO's Sustainable Agriculture Flagship, and the CSIRO, of course, is a unique Australian institution with a deep and proud history, global reputation for agricultural research. So he's well placed to help ask with some of these questions, how do we do more with less on a lot of fronts. He's currently directly involved as an advisor too with the federal government's carbon farming initiative. Could you please welcome Bryan Keating? Thanks,
Ron. Thank you, Fran, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see such a crowd here tonight. I was keen to place some of the challenges of feeding the world in 2050 firmly in the context of our experience over the last 50 years, when the world rose to some similar challenges that became known as the Green Revolution. Now, I tackle this with some great trepidation, sharing the stage here with Professor Swaminathan, who's a legend in terms of his role in the Green Revolution in Asia, and I'm very honoured to be here with you tonight, Professor. So let's look forward to 2050. What does the world food demand story look like? We've been looking at this inside CSIRO recently and come up with the conclusion that our best estimates are that world food demand is going to rise by somewhere between 50 and 80% between now and 2050. And the key drivers of this are, of course, population growth, shifts in the demand per capita for food associated with shifting diets, and shifting diets, of course, associated with economic growth, diversion of food to non-food uses such as biofuels, and continuing high levels of food wastage as food moves from paddocks through to plates. Now, that range from 50 to 80% reflects uncertainties in all these key drivers. And these are aggregated analyses, and there's likely to be geographic mismatches. Regions of strongest food demand won't necessarily match regions of strongest food supply, and temporal mismatches in terms of seasonal variation. So trade in food to deal with both space and time mismatches is going to continue to be important, in fact, likely to be more important looking forward. And Australia has always been a strong promoter of trade in agricultural products. And that's going to remain important, I believe. But let's look back. What lessons are there from the last 50 years? Between 1961 and 2008, world food production increased 179% in calorie terms. World population only increased 117%. So food production per capita increased significantly over those 50 years. And the numbers of undernourished people in the world declined, both in relative and absolute terms, until recently, where the absolute numbers have headed back the other way. So whatever way you look at it, the Green Revolution was a huge technical success. Yields rose by 2 to 3 times. Billions of people escaped malnutrition that would have occurred if those yields hadn't been achieved. And wider economic change was driven by those agricultural developments, particularly in Asia. The Green Revolution did not come free of costs, particularly in terms of resource use. We increased nitrogen fertiliser use by a factor of 7. We doubled the water abstractions for irrigation. And many ecosystems and biodiversity contained within those ecosystems are under severe stress. And there was a cost being borne that we didn't recognise for many years. About a third, up to a third of the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere today can be traced back to agricultural practices and land clearing to achieve that agricultural development. And while there was that great technical success with the Green Revolution, it did not eliminate hunger. Poverty and conflict was still driving hunger in many places in the world. And as a really broad generalisation, sub-Saharan Africa never saw that Green Revolution. So in recent years, the world's had this wake-up call on food security. There are many drivers of the 2007-8 food security crisis, but it was a timely reminder that there was a fine balance between food supply and demand, and a crisis could build quickly with devastating impacts. Civil society is only 3 meals away from chaos, and as we gather here tonight, the food price indices are reaching new highs, and how that's flowing through already what we're seeing in different parts of the world is beyond my expertise to judge, but you can't believe that the high food prices are helping with stability around the world at the moment. So my final point is to ask the question, well, what's going to be different as we look forward to the next agricultural revolution? I don't know what it's going to be called. Perhaps it will be called Professor Swaminathan's Evergreen Revolution, but it's got a new set of challenges. In relative terms, the scale of it is smaller than what's been achieved in the past. 50 to 80% increase from current day compared to the 179 increase that's been achieved. So what's the issue, you might ask? Well, the issue is these production increases have to be achieved in the face of much greater constraints. In absolute terms, the increase in production over the next 40 years is far greater than the absolute production increase over the last 50 years. In addition, the land, water, energy and nutrients are more contested, more constrained, and the global atmosphere can't continue to be a dumping place for greenhouse gases. And if they weren't sufficient challenge on their own, we've got the additional challenges and particularly the uncertainties generated by climate change. Some of which we've already seen, and some of which is still ahead of us. And I'm not sure anyone's really confident they fully understand how that climate change is going to play out over the next 40 years in terms of meeting this food security challenge. The uncertainties are great. So, Fran, let me summarise. The food security challenges ahead are real and they're pressing. The uncertainties are also great. Agricultural R&D is going to be critical, and the present signs are not good. Agricultural productivity is slowing. Investments in agricultural R&D have also been slowing. I personally remain positive for the world to feed and clothe itself in 2050, but this is not going to happen without a dedicated effort. Not just in terms of effort in agricultural R&D, which, important as that is, it's going to require the world's institutions and governance to address continuing challenges of poverty, conflict and inequity, and the world's ability to get climate change under control remains the big question mark as well. So thank you, Fran.
Thank you very much, Bryan.